If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, we are back and we have a man here, the sailor, Angel 45, that was his call sign, code name, Admiral Söderlund. I still struggle with that name, but one day I will stop apologizing for it. So you are most welcome with us. Thank you for being here. I know that you've read all the comments of the last episode. Sadly, we had a problem with the internet. We couldn't reply directly. But there was one interesting question here before we carry on. Can you tell us about Dieter Gerhard?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I did try and reply, but thank you for the opportunity to reply now. I was asked about my perspective of Commodore Dieter Gerhard and if I knew him. I did know him. In fact, by coincidence, I was due to meet with him about 10 days after he was arrested. He was chairman of the museum board of the South African Navy, and I, in fact, was the representative from Durban. And I had no problems with him. He was quite a nice guy. We were rather shocked and dismayed when we heard the news. I think it shattered everybody. An interesting thing about him was that I still believe that he didn't give away tactical information at all. And I'll give you the reason for that now. My current perception of him, because he is around, is that he served his time. And I'll be more than happy to chat to him again and to greet him. I mean, that is the whole thing. As a kid, my father was the necro chap in Kimberley, and I learned to pack Christmas presents for prisoners, and most of them were good, friendly people too afterwards. The reason I say he was not a tactical threat was that when we were writing the book, Joe and I writing the book, we discovered that the Russian veterans did not even realize we had strike craft up there. Yet I remember on one operation, in fact, SVA discusses it, it was Operation Amazon, most successful operation. My ship was damaged, and we actually put into Simonstown to get repaired. Our fellow ship, senior ship, went in ahead of me because I took extra damage and had to land somebody in Polfus. And he was down there to meet us. And if he didn't suspect something funny was on, I'd be very surprised. Yet it would appear to all of my research that he never actually sent anything about it. I believe that the Russians were not really interested in that level. That was a separate level. They were interested in strategic and NATO type information. But because of his British training and his contacts, he was very good with that. So he served his time. I have no further disrespect or respect for him. I'm quite happy to chat to him. But he was a pleasant enough fellow. But I do believe it was in for the money personally.
Well, I wish to say here that if a Commodore wants to speak to us and tell his side of a story, he's more than welcome. Everybody is welcome here. Let me say that again. Even what we consider to be the enemy, you know, it's a long time ago. We don't worry about that anymore. We are now trying to get the history. And as always, it's great for me to speak to people like you. Really, I find it fascinating to hear the stories, the insight. Now, I have to ask you, you were closely involved with a strike craft. You were a commander of two of them, I know. I've heard from Frans Fourie that you did some very daring things with that strike craft of yours. You went into Luanda Harbour once. I'm sure we'll get to that. Perhaps you were there more than once. But can you tell us the history of a strike craft? Last week we were speaking in general, and I really enjoyed it because I'm not a naval man. But I do like the Navy very much. So there's a certain terminology which we spoke about last week, and I'm grateful for that. So can you tell us the strike craft, you said to me it was the only choice at the time, and you people did marvelously well with it. But where does this come from? Where did the strike craft originated? Why them? What was wrong with the old frigates?
Chris, our Navy consisted of 3 modern frigates in the 1970s, early 70s, and then 2 very old destroyers and 2 other reserve frigates, which were subsequently sunk and dispersed. We definitely needed to increase our forces. We've got a long coastline, very long coastline. The British had previously supplied us with everything that flew over us at sea, that fired every weapon, everything was British. But as you know, in the 1970s, 60s, in fact, 67, the Labour government came in, or 64, I think, under Wilson, and they stopped us even getting our helicopters, our WASP helicopters. So it became obvious. So we started looking for a project to provide us with new surface warfare vessels. Bigger vessels and strike craft, talking about 1,000 to 2,000 tons. And we looked at various suppliers. England was out. The French made them. We looked at them, but they were quite expensive. And then we came across a certain type of light corvette called the João Palau, which was a Portuguese ship, which seemed quite a good idea. And we started a project with Taurus. It didn't last long. It was the beginning of the Armaments Board and Arms Corps, and they never got down to what they wanted. In fact, in the end, they built the ship up too big for it. And when the Caetano was toppled, we had to withdraw from that. At that stage, the Minister of Defense, P.W. Botha, had looked and seen the Israelis, and he started looking at these things. And he got into discussions with the Israelis about acquiring the Reshev, their missile boats. In 1975, I was the captain of the Fleur, and the one day, 2 of these Reshevs came into a harbor. I subsequently had to go and lay a target, and I know that P.W. Botha went out to sea with one of them, and I believe they sank the target with the guns. I must admit, I was very impressed, and for a youngster at that stage, that was what I wanted to run, not big old frigates. Anyway, in the beginning of 1975, some of my friends had suddenly started disappearing. And when you asked where they'd gone to, they were all gone to put sonder water, was the common story. And then at one stage, I got told by somebody, "You number 1 of number 2. I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You'll find out soon." And shortly after that, I got called in and I got told under great secrecy that I'd been selected as the second in command, or the number 1, we call him, of the second strike craft we built in Israel, and that I'd be taking my family across to Israel later that year. I was told I could tell only my wife, couldn't tell my parents or anyone else at that stage. And we slowly started preparing, because I now realized where Pitsonderwater was. And finally, in October, I flew up, I handed over my ship, and I flew to Israel, and with me was the captain of the ship, the weapons officer, who both who became admirals as well, and the engineer, plus the wife, the engineer of this first strike craft. And it was quite an experience, because this is the beginning of Project Japonica. What had actually happened was we signed a contract with the Israeli aircraft industry as the go-between to acquire 6 strike craft from the Israelis. Israeli shipyards were going to build 3, and Sandok Austral in Durban were going to build another 3. It had to be kept very secret because of the political state of the world. We were both pariah nations, but both of us had to be very careful. From my personal perspective, I arrived there in October 1975, and we were put into hotels and set to work almost immediately. And the 4 of us, the 4 officers, plus 2 or 3 others, started doing language courses. Because even though English is spoken by many Israelis, we were the first people that went across with the senior officers who were going to stand by the building of the strike craft. We also had to do all the documentation, translations, and we were going to have to build all experience, because we were going to have to sail them back by ourselves, not the Israelis. So we did a very fascinating language course in Haifa. And on completion, most of us had spoke a very basic Hebrew, but could at least read it as well, the basics, which was enough for us to start. Early in the year, 1976, we were more settled there. It was very interesting settling in, because everything was under secrecy. And I just want to mention that even communications, we didn't have cell phones or anything in those days. We were not allowed to make any contact. We weren't even allowed to receive letters directly. If your family wanted to write to you, they wrote to a private bag in Pretoria, and inside was your envelope. This got sent to the diplomatic the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It went in the dip bag. In Israel, it was picked up and brought to us, and we got our mail. Mail was quite important in those days for morale. And I know, I'll never forget, in 77, we went for 6 weeks over Christmas without a single letter, Christmas card or anything. It was interesting. Anyway, in the second year, 1976, we started a weapons course, and there were the 6 officers from the first 2 strike craft who had to be able to understand the weapons system and everything, which was the 2 commanders, the 2 second-in-commands, and the 2 weapons officers. And attached to us was the designated captain for the 4th vessel we built in South Africa. One of the most brilliant officers I have ever met in my life, people I've ever met in my life. He subsequently became Chief of the Navy. In fact, I wrote his biography, a chap called Johan Retief. And he was, in fact, was part of the staff across there. The headquarters was a small organization called SAMMIDE, SAMMIDE, which actually meant South African Mission Middle East. And it was a very funny setup because we had no links. All the money came through private accounts with the OC, Captain Oric, and 2 of the other staff in their names. It was completely against all the treasury rules, but everything was secret. And it was a fascinating life. Now, Johan Retief was the training officer on that, but he also had to attend the course with us. And that course was approximately 4 months, 4 to 5 months. I'm not sure of the exact duration, but we learned all about the equipment on the ship, the weapon systems, the missiles. What is more important was the Israelis had developed the first digital fire control computer in the world. It's called ISAC 70, and they were still going through the development process. And I'll never forget, Johan Retief used to sit next to me in the classroom. And when the lecturer came in to explain how the system was going to work, the logics of the system, because all goes about logics with digital computers, Johan Retief asked the man a question and said, wouldn't it be easier if you did this? The chap looked down and he said, okay, let's stop now. We'll resume tomorrow. The next day he didn't turn up. We were told to do something else. And when he came the following week, he said, it's all been changed. And he gave us exactly what Johan Retief had told. So we've got some brilliant South Africans. On completion of that course, which was a very, very interesting course, an intense course, we were lectured by people from the factory, developers from the universities. It was a very high-level course. The next step was we had to learn a bit about their ships. What the arrangement was, even though the Navy was not really involved, we were given 3 to 4 months serving on board their ships. I can just mention that it started off as quite a good idea until, I'm not going to go into details, but in actual fact, one of the strike craft with a South African on board was on patrol when they drew fire. And apparently, one of the bullets hit a chap standing next to this South African, and he shouted, medic, 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 across the firing. The chap grabbed him and said, I'm the medic. Anyway, because of this, they said we no longer do operations. However, at that stage, Sharm el-Sheikh was still part of the Israeli Navy. In fact, the strike craft that came by Simonstown that I'd seen, 4 of them, in fact, the later 2, were all stationed down there. And 2 of us were very lucky. We got sent down to go and do our training. In fact, a lot of us were in Sharm el-Sheikh. It was fantastic there. We were out of the public eye, so there was no civilians in the area. It was a very military area in the middle of at the bottom of the peninsula. We were given a three-roomed hut for our officers' quarters, and we moved in and we were attached to the Israeli Navy ships. It was an excellent chance because we worked with them, we worked alongside them. And in fact, contrary to what they said, we couldn't do operations. In 1 week of being down there on an Erev Shabbat, we were on the standby ship, 2 of us. And just as we were finishing our supper on the jetty, they take the tables out. It's a very special, sort of religious supper in Israel. there was an alarm, and the next thing, the captain was given a message, and we've got 10 minutes to sail. And we stood there knowing we weren't allowed to go on operations. The captain just looked at us and said, "Aren't you coming?" We jumped on board. And it was a very interesting operation. It's a very valuable one. If you don't mind, I think I'll just mention it because it illustrates some of the points I want to make later. What had happened was that the Egyptians had given an American company permission to drill for oil off of Sinai. The Israelis said, no, that's ours now, we control it. And what had happened is a tug had come in and made buoys to moor this boat, drilling bore too. Anyway, we rushed around, and this is at night, late at night, and it wasn't too far. And when we got there, we saw the tug. They immediately told the tug to move and to get out of the area fast. Then we opened up with the 20 millimeters and sank the buoy. I think the bullets flying into the buoy also helped the tug to make a quick departure. It was quite interesting. It showed you the determination. But we then hung around doing a sort of patrol to make sure the tug didn't come back. And shortly after that, the W system suddenly gave us information that they picked up 2 vessels sailing from a port in Egypt, and they classified them as an Oza, which is a missile boat carrying 4 missiles, and a Söderlund, which is a torpedo boat, same size, but does torpedoes. This upped the ante, and it became very interesting. We all were at action stations at this stage. And the next thing, we were joined by these 2 ships, the Oza leading the Söderlund. But the part that always fascinated me was we were sailing north towards Suez, and we were on the left-hand side, i.e. on the Egyptian side, and they were on the Israeli side, both insisting we're in Own's waters. While we were doing this, we had our guns trained on the Oza. The Söderlund was astern. And all of a sudden, it was the Söderlund opened fire. But it was a 30 millimeter gun. And it gave quite a shock to most of us. I know for a fact that I immediately moved behind some boxes in the bridge until I realized those were the ammunition lockers. And I thought, that's not very clever. So I stood behind a chap who was rather big. I just realized that I was never made for the army to fire like that. Anyway, the thing that struck me immediately was the captain shouted, "Check, check, check." And shortly after that, the message came back. The Söderlund was apologizing. It was an accident. However, the thing that I'll never forget is that both our guns were on the Oza, and we had nothing on the Söderlund. And I asked the captain afterwards, I said, "Why were you on the Oza? Because if it fires a missile, it's got not a hope in hell. You've got to be at least 6 kilometers. It's not within his firing arc at all." And his answer was that she's a legal target, the other one's not. I said, whereas the other one could have fired a torpedo. And he said, well, the actual reason is we can't separate the system. Now, when I mean system, we've got 2 guns. We've got a director and a radar, fire control radar. And I suggested, why don't you put the gun and the director on the first one and the other 2? He said, no, it's physically impossible. When I spoke to then Commander Retief about this, he said, oh. And a short while later, he explained to them how they could. And the Israeli and South African strike craft got a separate system, so you could put 1 gun to director, 1 gun. So this is just an illustration of how quick some of the South Africans adapted to it. Anyway, it was a very exciting incident. We went alongside in a tour, and the minister came down because we thought this could be the start of something big. Funny enough, Commander Retief was on one of the strike craft right down at the bottom of the straits, the Ethiopian border, and they came rushing up. It was also very impressive because one of their boats, which was out of the water in refit, was back in the water within about 8 hours. The crews were being flown back from all over Israel. But it was very interesting to see how they reacted, how quick they were. The time down in Sharim was very, very valuable because we did a lot of exercises. We did 1 or 2 of the operations, not quite the same as this one. But it did play havoc on some of our personal lives because while you were down there, we were very isolated. And there was always 2 ships on standby, 2 ships on delayed standby, and 2 ships off. which meant that every 2 weeks, what I meant to tell you was that it wasn't a commercial. There was, Dahab was a holiday resort, but very few tourists came down there. There were no regular flights and things. But at Shabbat on Friday, at lunchtime on Friday, aircraft would fly in. They would bring families for men on duty, and they would take away people not on duty back to Tel Aviv. So you could have some time back, because the desert there was very, very rough. Anyway, the problem was, of course, that there was a limited number of seats. The other thing which was interesting is that you arrived back in Tel Aviv, because the flights only went after 12:30. You got back quite late, and don't forget, at sundown, nothing moved. And luckily, Haifa, you could get to Haifa, at least you could get a taxi from there. So in fact, you only had one day, Shabbat, Saturday, because Yom Rishon, Sunday, you had to be back at work. So 5 o'clock in the morning, back to Tel Aviv, Lud Airport, and flying down again. Just a personal anecdote. While we were there, we decided to acquire a motor car. My wife had 2 children, and she had a 3rd child born there. She arrived there pregnant, and she was stuck now without me, and we'd ordered a motor car, a duty-free motor car. And this arrived while I was in Sharm el-Sheikh, and they told her to come down and fetch her car, which was quite interesting because she climbed on a bus with a baby on her back, or on a carrier, went down there and was shown the car in the showroom. And she said, forget it, I'm not taking it home. She made the payment. He said, well, it's got to be out of here today. So in the end, she had to climb in this car and drive it home, having never driven a car with gears, having never driven on the left-hand drive, and having never driven in Israel. As she says, she went around one circle about 4 times before she could follow someone out. So that was one of the problems with this lot. But Sharm el-Sheikh was a lovely place to be, because we were very much on our own. We lived with the Israelis, so we learned a lot. Little interesting story, they had a thing called the Mardon, which is the officers' club. Everybody ate in the canteen. But this was a club given to them, a building given to them by some American organization, foundation. And it had a pub in it, and a snooker table and a few things. But shortly after we got there, the roof caved in. And because it wasn't part of their operational side, etc., they just left it. Now, we had our 3 rooms, and I got to know the captain's secretary quite well, and she let us have a fridge. And we decided we were going to drink beer because it was a very hot place. And I'll never forget, 2 of us went across to the Shechem, which was like the Savi. We went to the lady there, and we ordered in Hebrew, Arbaisrim Pachiot Bira, meaning we want a case of beer, 24 beers. And she went to the fridge and she brought back 1 beer. So it's no, 24. She went back, and I'll never forget it. She pulled out 17 tins of beer. This is a naval base with a few hundred people there. The Israelis are not big drinkers. They had 17 beers. We explained that we were getting more people coming down, so we suggested they stock up. And we ended up becoming the social center, because all the officers from around used to come and drink with us, the Israelis, and it became a very social place. And in fact, one evening we were drinking when 2 of us had an idea. We were talking and saying, this now is Pat Sonder Water. So we went and got a big, thick Koki pen, and we wrote in Hebrew, Pat Sonder Water, next to the door, thinking we were very clever, till we realized that the only people who could read it were the Israelis, and they'd never seen a word called Pat Sonder Water, or about 7 or 8 of the South Africans who had actually learned to understand Hebrew. And I'll come back to that one later, because there's an interesting story behind it. But during this period, what was also interesting was Commander Retief came down to do his command exam. Now, this is quite an important exam, and it's very, very stressing. And since I was first lieutenant of the 2nd ship, he was going to do his exam on the ship that I was on. So the captain said, you do all the first lieutenant's work, which is when you come alongside, you do the wires, the moorings, etc. And I thought, no problem. Because on our language course, we've been taught the Hebrew for all the seamanship terms. They've gone to a lot of trouble to give us translations of the various words. And we learned these all. And we learned how to run the ships, how to make the engines go and everything. And I'll never forget, we went out. When it was time to come in, I mustered the party and I briefed them. And I looked at what they had, and I couldn't see any fenders, which you put between the key. So in my best Hebrew, I said, Eifo pogashim. Was pogashim. Him is normally the meervoud. Pogash was the word. They looked at me, and I said, pogashim. And eventually I said, what's the Hebrew for fenders? Fenderim. I discovered that half the words they used was English with im at the end of it. But it was quite an interesting experience. It was fun. So basically, our time in showroom was very valuable. We learned a lot, and it prepared us. But we could only have a certain amount of time there, because what was going on back home is they were constructing our ships, and we had to do all the documentation. We looked at the South African Navy documentation. These are your orders and instructions, your procedures, your activities, all documented. We realized that submarines were the most professional that we had. And we decided to use their system. And each of the 6 officers from the 2 ships, there was a captain, first lieutenant, and weapons officer on each ship, and the 2 engineers, was given a task. I, for example, had to do the general task, which was the knowledge of the ship, and the seamanship task book. One chap did the operations task group, one did the weapons task group, a task book. We all had to do all the documentation and write the task books. And this kept us very, very busy. At the time, the only officers we had were in the dockyard itself, and they gave 3 little cabooses, little smaller cabins for each of the ships, and we'd work from there. But we do all the documentation ourselves, we did the drawings ourselves, and we slowly developed the procedures. At the same time, we used to always go through the ship every day. In fact, I went through the first ship as well. So I learned more about my ship. And then when it got to that stage, this is during the fitting out, and they're putting the pipes in and the wires in. And we were watching the quality. And it was actually quite interesting that we discovered that the quality of the ship build was not very good initially. And the IAI had agents with us who were excellent. They liaised with the shipyard. And we discovered that the reason was that when they stopped building their strike craft, most of the good people had gone and found jobs. And they had now recruited people who could weld, could cut, etc., but didn't have the knowledge of the shipbuilding standards. And in fact, it became so bad that we kept telling them to remove parts or items from boat number 1. We actually found a mistake in the fire main system that had cut things out again. And as a joke, we nicknamed the first boat Patches, because she was always having holes cut and patched again to do it. It went a lot better with my ship, boat 2. And it was very interesting to see a ship being built, because it enhanced your knowledge of construction and everything like that. Just to cut aside, in the meantime, some of us had other responsibilities as well, because we now had between 50 and 60 South African families, all living in isolation, quietly, places where nobody should know where they were. And we got permission to have a school in Israel. And it was a chief of the Navy arranged this to be done. And we had a lawyer at Samite, a chap called Abe Golden, I think, Abe Golden, ex-South African who lived in Israel. As they said, he was expensive, but he was good. He was a good Israeli lawyer. And he used to look after our interests very, very well. And he negotiated with a school at Kfar Galim, which is on the other side, 10 kilometers from Haifa. And they arranged a little school, primary school, up to standard 5 for the South Africans there. And in fact, they actually built a little additional classrooms on for us, which we paid for. And we had 3 teachers, a Fadi Steinberg and his wife, and then another lady came out afterwards. And this became the South African school. It was quite interesting because I ended up on the school board for my sons, and it was actually a lovely organization. The most interesting story, though, was that following good South African tradition, they had a school bell. And every morning they'd ring the bell and all the kids would line up, as they do in South Africa. And this fascinated the Israeli pupils and the principal. It was an agricultural college. And he was amazed by this bell. One of the arrangements was that when we finished in February 78, we closed the school because the last families came back. The buildings were handed over to him. And this principal was more interested in getting the bell because he said it had magical terms because the Israelis are not very disciplined when it comes to kids. And he was given the bell, which I think gave him a lot of help. His students knew what it was. I digressed. I just want to mention as well that life in Israel was very, very difficult for the families. I mean, we were busy, we were going to sea, etc. But the culture in Israel is very different to here. It's different. You get used to it very quickly. But their food types, their timings, everything, and the language is different. But the one thing that really caught us out as well was that you weren't allowed to tell anybody what you were there for. You had to have cover stories. And these cover stories didn't always work very well. We arrived and we got given a flat away from most people, just above the Baha'i Shrine, a very modern building. And we were on the second floor. And my wife befriended a young wife on the first floor called Yael. And they became very good friends. In fact, they even stayed friends when my wife told her whoever built this building was a pretty shoddy worker because there are holes in the walls that haven't been finished. And she then informed us her father was the owner and the builder, and it was her wedding present. But she took it very well. Of course, now I've forgotten what I was going to say. But, about the stories. And she asked what we were doing there. So my wife promptly said that I'm there. My cover story was to study shipbuilding at the Technikon, which is up on the Carmel. And her immediate reaction was, oh, I work there. He can have a lift through with me in the mornings because we didn't have a car then. And that caused some backpedaling. And then came the crunch. It turned out her husband was worked for the manufacturer of our EW system, and he was instructing our South Africans. However, never once while we were there did we ever let on that they knew it. They became very good friends. Other problems were the financial system. When we arrived there, our pay was all given in lirot. Now, they've got shekels now. In those days, a lira was the pound. It's a translation of pound, and that was our salary. The trouble was that it depreciated so fast that prices were going up. I'll never forget, if you wanted to make a phone call in Israel, you had a little token. Very clever, the post office. There's a special token called an asimon. And the asimonim was a plural of them. And these gave you phone calls. But because they stayed relevant, every time these things became available, people bought them out because it was almost an investment because the pound went down so fast. And eventually they said, okay, we can have half in dollars, half in pounds. But there's also a catch. A dud check in Israel is a criminal offense. So we had to be very, very careful that you only transferred dollars and you never paid out more than that, otherwise you would have sunk. Luckily, towards the end, sanity prevailed and we got all our money in dollars, which made it easier for them. One other little thing that made life easier was there was a supermarket at the Carmel, and the butcher up there decided he was going to make boerewors. And it became one of his best sellers, not just to South Africans. But life was fun in Israel. The shipyard built the ships. They built them. The final products were acceptable, very good. The only problem was that towards the end, life was getting tough. There was pressure. Odd reports were sneaking out that something was going on. And one report, we were accused of letting information out. Luckily, we were able to prove it wasn't from us, and we were able to pinpoint the source, which was an apology from us, for us. But in 1977, the first ship finally sailed. That was it was in August, at the 24th of August. But it was quite a procedure because at that stage, both countries were nervous that there might be an attempt on it. So they came up with a system whereby she would be completely disguised, wear all the colors, etc., of an Israeli strike craft, even with a recognition flag on the top of the bridge. And she was escorted by two and went off. She came home. In my case, we continued and we started progressing very well. And finally, November, towards the end of November, they were fitting out great progress. On the 4th of November, I'll never forget, I was at home in my flat in Haifa, watching the news on TV when the UN announced a complete embargo, arms embargo of South Africa. We were due to be completed and to sail at the end of December, so we thought, and I immediately drove down to the dockyard. And we went to go and quickly make an assessment of how much fuel we had and everything, in case we had to try exactly what the Israelis did. Not for planning it, because I knew what was going to happen the next morning. And sure enough, the next morning, Captain Arnè called us out into the open, Captain and myself, and said, are we going to make a break for it? And both of us, having served in the Israeli Navy, said, not unless they say we can, because there is no ways you'll pull that one over the Israelis. We realized that immediately. Anyway, so the decision was made that we do nothing, that he was going through to go and see the ambassador and hopefully to get some clearance, because the world was going to embargo arms. We walked back to the ship, and the first thing I noticed, there was a tanker loading fuel. And I went to the IA representative and I said, we've got enough fuel for the trials. And he said to me, no, I don't think so. We might want to stay at sea longer after the trials. I then got knocked on a door and the engineering chap called me and said, can you come to my office for a minute? I'll never forget, Itzik Afek, all ex-Navy, and both of them had been in Cherbourg with the Israeli boats that escaped. He took me to his office and he showed me a filing cabinet where all our ship's drawings were. And he said to me, by the way, look at that lock. If you kick it just over there, it'll open. And, oh, did I show you my files? Let me find out where I hide the key. Show me the files. Then sent me back to the ship. During that day, all of a sudden, people came to do work that wasn't being specified, such as the anchoring arrangements. It was very obvious that the general trend there was they were going to get us home, come what may. Anyway, 2 days later, it was confirmed that the Israelis had thought that no new orders, anything that was in the pipeline, they were going to finish. We commissioned on the 30th of November, a little parade, and went to sea the next day, and we were doing sea trials. The whole plan was that we were going to now sail at the end of December, we were going to sail back to South Africa. In the meantime, the families had to be sent home. So we had to get the families home. So while we were still there, and most had gone except for 4 families, mine and 3 others. They were going to go on I think the 10th, they were due to fly out. So we had time to pack them up and go. However, unbeknown to anybody, except for the captain, myself, the engineer, weapons officer, and base OC, everything was ready. We were going to sail on the 6th. It had to be kept secret. It was a secret of the Israelis. And I'd always said to my wife, if I don't come home and you find my nice shoes in the electrical box outside, you'll find the keys and everything inside there is all my keys and everything. And on the 6th, when I went to work, I put my shoes into the box, the keys, and they picked me up. We then told the ship's company we would plan to go to sea. We were going to sea for a few days for trials, for workup. We then told them that nobody's going to go ashore now, going home. And we sailed that night with the 2 Israeli ships. And I left behind a very, very irate wife, especially when she opened the box and found them. She was left with 3 young kids. She had to give back our flat. She had to sell our car. And the car was on my passport because it was duty free. Anyway, and we sailed for home. It was a very interesting trip home. The 2 Israeli ships escorting us were overflown by American aircraft who seemed to accept we were an Israeli force. Until we hit bad weather, we went through the Straits of Messina. Doing this, one of the Israeli strike craft, earlier SAR-2, had its entire wave break peeled back, and she flooded, and she had to make for home. But we eventually got to Gibraltar, where we said our fond farewells, swapped whiskey and brandy, and we headed for home. To get home was quite a long voyage, and because we couldn't stop anywhere. There were no friendly ports around. But the SAS Tafelberg, which was our replenishment ship, was waiting for us off the Canaries. The weather was terrible. We couldn't, in fact, refuel. And eventually we were able to refuel under horrendous weather. In fact, I got washed off the ship, but on my buffer, I had a safety line on, but my buffer, chief seaman with me, just grabbed me and held me, saved my life. We refueled, restocked, only one catch. We used so-called submarine rations, which are, now, for readers that don't, or listeners that don't know, the submariners have a very limited space, so they have very special menus made up. There are 48 people in a ship's company, so they get 48 little steaks, 48 little pies, 48 this, 48 that. So everything's easy. There's no carving, there's no fighting. It's all petite little packs. So we had a similar system, which we developed there, and they were going to give us submarine victuals across. So when we met with Tafelberg, they transferred 47, because we had a crew of 47 of these victuals across. The problem number one was they also sent a doctor. Nobody had realized that the doctor made us 48, they gave us 47. So we had 47 of everything. But what was worse was that on a strike off pounding around, you don't want finicky little food. So submarines, sedate life, had all sorts of little biltong and little portions. We wanted big food because you had to carry it through the ship to go and eat. And that made it a very, very difficult time trying to carve sections of meat for everybody. But we had a second rendezvous with Tafelberg, where she again gave us our stuff. And luckily the captain convinced them to untick, because we wanted supplies for our canteen, because we had no stock cigarettes or anything on board. But they wanted cash. They wouldn't take dollars, believe it or not, in those days. But luckily, the doctor agreed to give us some. And we got 2 cases of beer as well, because Christmas Day was spent at sea. And on Christmas Day, we each had a beer. The last time I've ever come across having a beer at sea, we felt it was on Christmas night, the night of Christmas. We arrived in Simonstown on our way home. And it was a very welcome home, coming home. Just from a personal idea, we got in at 9 o'clock. Nobody was allowed near the ship. And we got a telephone line, and one of our friends brought down a few cases of beer. We all had a beer. And I'd left my wife in Haifa, and I went to the line and I said, it's outside dialing tone, and I phoned her parents' house to find out where she was. She could either be in Kimberley with my mother, with her parents, or in Durban waiting for us. And it was about 11 o'clock now when a very tired voice answered the phone. She was there. So she came to pick me up very quickly. So I was forgiven. But it was a very interesting experience. Getting back, the story kept going, I'm afraid, because South Africa had announced we had one of the boats. So the rule was that one boat could be in Durban, one here. And in fact, it was quite interesting, because when we had to go into dry dock, or we had to do something in Durban, they had to fly up the captain from the other ship because he'd known the pilot. And they also came and put telephones on board the first ship. When we came in, we wanted telephones as well. And unfortunately, the same chap arrived. He said, "What have you done?" And he got most upset. But this continued for some while. Anyway, that was the saga of getting the strike off back to South Africa. I don't know if you've got any questions on the Israeli side, because when you finished, I did go back to Israel after that, which I can mention as well.
Well, I'm absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that. Yes, I have a lot of questions, actually. I'm glad you mentioned the word Cherbourg, just in passing with one of our officers. I think Cherbourg was the original class, and then came the Reshef, which was the Israeli class, and then came the strike craft.
No, actually, it was SAR class. Cherbourg was where they were built. It's a French port of Cherbourg. But the class was the SAR class. It was a SAR 1, SAR 2, SAR 3. And the Israelis then developed the SAR 4, which was the larger one. She was the 48 meter. It's embarrassing. 59 meter. With 2 guns and the 6 missiles. That was the Israeli development, but it was based on the German 143 and 145s, 147s, can't remember.
Okay, that's fascinating. Were there a major difference between the South African ones and these that we developed a bit further?
No. When you say the South African ones, the ones built there, the next three were built here exactly to the same. We always built them to the same standard. Later, we made a certain number of changes to cope. I mean, the small changes were magazines. We fitted takeaway stuff so we could convert them for strike or special operations. But that was about all. They were all basically the same.
I've heard somewhere that the larger navies have like 2 crews for every ship, especially their submarines. Would that be the same for South Africa?
No. The gold and blue is an American system, but in fact, they sometimes have more than that. The Royal Navy has, for its mine countermeasure vessels, they have a number of crews and they rotate them through. In the old days, people could go to sea for 2 years and not come home. That's no longer socially acceptable. So they now spend up, not sure, I think it's 4 to 6 months. Some ships, such as the survey ships, have a much bigger crew. So 1/3 can be on leave at any one time, because they deploy for long distances and long periods. But we have basically 1 crew per ship. It makes responsibility easier. When you start changing crews, certain items might just start disappearing. We prefer the way we do it.
I'm thinking of how long that voyage took from Haifa all the way to Durban. Because what route would you have taken? Right through the Mediterranean and then left south down the African coast?
Yeah, in fact, on our trip, we actually went around Sardinia, much further. But it took 18 days. So 18 and a bit days. We met up with the tanker, and the problem was that even though we were fast, the tanker had to get from its first point up in the Canary Islands down to a point in mid-ocean. So we could not do the second leg. We had to go at a very slow speed. I say slow speed. We cruised along as opposed to going at a nice cruising speed. And even that was a bit of a problem, because when we had to meet up with her a few hundred miles off the coast, she wasn't there. Luckily, I was the navigator, but I had an assistant navigator who was doing this side. And luckily, I was able to go check, and I discovered he was 1 degree out, which is 60 miles. And at full speed, that's 2 hours. So we were able to, what I didn't tell you is we had no radio, we were not allowed to use radio communications or anything. We did it completely silent, no flags, nothing. It was a very secret voyage. Nowadays, impossible with satellites, but in those days, we achieved it. So if anything appeared in the horizon, we went the other way. But we eventually caught up with Tafelberg, and she forgave us. She forgave us not finding her, but she never forgave us, I think, for keeping her away for Christmas. Because if it wasn't for us, she'd have been home for Christmas.
So when you talk about in Navy terms of a darkened out ship or blacked out ship, you actually do mean this. The thing, there's no lights.
Yeah, no, I was listening to some of your stories from, I think it was France, SVA talking. Before we go in, we darken ship and we close the deadlights, so everything is dark. We always used to rig false fishing lights if we needed them. When we come to discussing that, I'll explain that better and give you examples of it. But that was how we played our operations. On the voyage back, we didn't have to worry about darkening out because we avoided all shipping at all times. But we had no radar. We couldn't use radar because radar gives away a signal. Not likely to be picked up in the middle of the ocean, but it's a policy. And except when going through the Straits of Gibraltar, that was I use the word hairy experience, because when you report ships in the Navy on radar, they all get given an identity, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and we were going through Alpha Charlie because we had 20, 30 ships on the screen, and waving your way through that, you just close your eyes and open. But for the rest of the way, we were in open ocean, so we didn't have to worry too much about that. But we had no communications. We could listen, we could get messages, but we couldn't reply. That was the problem.
I want to take you back to an incident, if you don't mind, from where the SAR class comes from. I believe an Egyptian sunk an Israeli Navy ship with missiles.
Yeah.
Perhaps if you can tell us the story, please.
Yeah, that goes back some time, in the 60s. An Israeli destroyer was sunk by 6 missiles fired by a Komar, which is a smaller, the earlier version, but which only had 2 missiles. And I'm trying to think of its name. There's a sister ship. The Egyptians had a sister ship, funny enough. But when they lost that ship, they realized this was the future. It was missiles. And they then perfected the Gabriel missile, which is the basic missile we had. The first was a short-range missile. This is a medium range, was the later one. They still use a Gabriel, but not the same one. It's a series of missiles which have progressed. But that they learned, School of Hard Knocks. Israelis learn from history. Most people don't.
I've heard some interesting stories about the Israeli Navy, even further back than this incident where they sank a destroyer of theirs, which was a World War II vessel. I can't remember the name myself. I believe it was something Scottish, but they changed the name, of course, when it reached Israeli service. But they were rescuing Jews from behind enemy lines at one stage. I don't know if you know about the operation, where the Israeli Navy went and they would get these Jews out of enemy territory by way of sea. They were actually very, very good at clandestine type of operations.
Very good. We saw that.
Now that we mentioned the Gabriel missile, I remember in the 80s, and we were probably wrong, but you hear so we can ask, that the Navy, the strike craft got re-equipped with Exocet missiles. Would that be true?
Nope. I know even during the Falklands War, people suspected we'd given Exocets to the Argentinians. We never had them. We couldn't get them. We do have them now, but that was under much different circumstances. We only had the Gabriel, and in fact, the Scorpion we had. An excellent missile. I can tell you that, because it had a semi-active guidance system. It wasn't fire and forget. Now, some years later, I'm talking about a few years ago, the German Navy sent out its vessels here to come and exercise with us. It's a series called Good Hope. And we also did firing trials with their missiles against our missiles. We expended missiles for them. At that stage, our missiles were no longer really operational. And they were going to use their missiles to shoot them down. And they had a RAM system, which is an American system, very classified. And the RAM system had a person who authorized firing if something went wrong. Our missiles were supposed to fall into the sea before they got there if they weren't shot down. And we fired 6 missiles. One of the missiles kept going. They didn't shoot it down. And the chap turned around to release the RAM missile, which was their last-ditch defense. The South African with him said, I wouldn't bother. You can't take it out, because we were, as long as our missile was on the radar path, you couldn't detect it. Couldn't be, and it wasn't transmitting, whereas the RAM missile works on a transmission. So it itself didn't pick up the target. It picked up our radar picked it up and gave it instructions, our own radar. So it was a very, very useful missile too.
Our Navy did some astonishing things. I know you must be aware of this, where the South African submarine sank in an exercise now, I believe an entire NATO squadron in 2008.
Oh, yes. Oh, that's when you said sank, I was worried for a second. I can tell you that was the latest submarine, the German 209s. But since 1971, when our first submarines arrived here, I know of not a single occasion in which any warship, foreign warship, has ever detected one of our submarines in the Cape area. Not one. The water conditions are very, very tricky here. Completely different to the Mediterranean, where you pick up a submarine at any stage. Here, there's layers. The submarine goes below the layers. Also, our submarines are very small. And even when we had nuclear submarines, attack submarines here, we had the Sun 1, the Los Angeles submarine. We have two British submarines here. And they never pick up our submarines. For the simple reason that all we do is we point them 5 or 10 degrees off the bow. And even if they're using active sonar, they don't like to pick us up. But either way, we're below the level. We just point them the whole time and we keep quiet. So very much so. But you're right. An interesting story about that. It was a NATO force, American destroyer, Aegis destroyer. And there were 2 reporters on board. They had press out with them. And 2 lady reporters were on the American one. And after the exercise, the captain called them to say goodbye to them because they were going to depart. And he said, technically, I should not be sitting here. We should be sitting in a life raft out at sea. They acknowledged it. Our submarines were good.
Yes, I've heard about that they got the firing solutions and kept them, which is like a sniper rifle aiming at somebody. You just pull that trigger at your end. It is actually a fantastic Navy. I'm very proud of it.
Except a submarine has to avoid hunters, and he can't hide behind a tree or a rockwood either. He has got to negotiate distance, depth, etc. to get around. And before you get to the main body, you've got to get to the protection, the escorting force. So it's not easy.
Yes, in that exercise, the ships were trying to protect this merchantman or something. Yeah. And that submarine actually got through, and in the, if I say sunk, I mean electronic, sunk all of it. I find it very quite funny, that one.
He fires a green flare, which indicates he's fired a torpedo, which gives away his position, but it also proves he was there. Now, I was going to say, to get back to Israel, that was my first stint in Israel. In mid-1981, my strike craft was in a refit, and 2 captains of South African strike craft were invited to go across to Israel. And the decision was made to take one who had been there before as a comparison, to compare, and also had a benefit, and a new captain. And 2 of us went across there, and I understood enough Hebrew to be able to see what was going on, and we made some beautiful discoveries of the advances they'd had since we'd been there. What is interesting is we went down to visit Sharm el-Sheikh. And at that stage, they were about to hand it back to Egypt. And we walked down, because we went out to sea when a ship on 2 of their strike craft for exercises. They were going out to Eilat anyway. And while walking through, I went to where our hut was, and our little prefab building with the 3 rooms in it was gone. But the ops room opposite it was still there, where our junior ratings had slept. But we went out, did our exercise at sea, and it was quite interesting because on the strike craft that I'd served in, which was still there, not a single person was there when I was there. So they rotate their crews very fast. From there, we went up to Ashdod, which is up in the north, which where the Aburim, the smaller boats, are kept. And we walked through the base. And all of a sudden, I stopped dead. Because in the base, I saw a prefab, and written on front of it in Hebrew. And I said to my guide there, I said, read that. Looked at it and said, I said, that. They obviously removed it and put it up in Ashdod. So I found my old home again. But an interesting story, which I was reminded in your interview with Frans Fourie, who, by the way, Frans Fourie is the epitome of a special forces operator. I've seen him in various levels and various actions. He's unbelievable. But I know one thing about him, which I think he told you, he got it slightly wrong. No, didn't get it wrong. While we were there, we were suddenly called in and told we had to present ourselves for a reception because the chief of the South African Defence Force, General Viljoen, and his wife wanted to meet us. We duly arrived, and who was there? But a lot of people we knew, David Fourie, Frans Fourie, and a whole lot of others, all had beers, etc. Then the guest arrived, and it was a very high-level function. And the guest, of course, was Stofstreepie, Chief of the Defence Force. And he duly addressed us all. And I'll never forget it, because he was telling us all about how he admired us for our fortitude and being willing to serve the fatherland, because he knows that as that Boeing took off at Jan Smuts, his heart felt because he was leaving his motherland, etc. And he understood how much effort it took for us to serve the country in a foreign country, etc. And I nearly burst out laughing, because David and France had just been telling me about how over weekends they checked out of their hotel, they put all the stuff in one room, and then they got paid, and they used that money to go on their holidays, which he admits to, by the way. But I went to get a beer from the fridge, and I know it was David for you, I think France and David were giggling over a packet. And I looked at this lot and I said, I know these buggers. Excuse the word buggers, but they were naughty little buggers. And I watched them, and they walked out, and I watched France go to not just a general, but to the Chief of the South African Defence Force. In his story, he just mentions a general. And I watched him offer to Mr. and Mrs. Liebenberg, not Liebenberg, Stofstreepie, Viljoen, and his wife, dog biscuits. So that part is true, except he took his career into danger there, because Stofstreepie wasn't the man to be messed with. But that was also a very valuable experience, and we came back with a lot of new information, a lot of new, which all prepared us, because at that stage, we'd done our first operations. Amazon had been done, and we learned a lot, and we came back with information, including, we were very lucky, we went out with a new lengthened strike craft. They had taken the strike craft and put a 4.5 meter plug in the middle. Now, it didn't seem like a very important thing, but it lengthened the strike craft, and interestingly enough, it increased the speed. We wrote the two of us went with myself, chap who's passed away, Fani Ace, and I took their basic design, and we designed for us, because we were building 4 more strike craft at the time. And we put this plug in, and when we were asked what do we want to use that area for, we said for a dining hall. And they sort of looked at us and said, a dining hall, this is an operational strike craft. We said, yes. Up until then, well, at that stage, in a bouncing strike craft, all the men got their food for the messes or got their own food one by one. Had to go through the operations room, through a gun bay, through an engine room to get to where they could eat it. And half the time they spilled it. In fact, it was so stupid that the officers' heads, one of the senior ratings claimed the officers' heads as his dining seat. So the officers couldn't go to the, I don't know if you know, heads or toilets, because people sat all the way along because they could not get their food through. And this was right below the galley. So we showed how we could make it into a dining hall. But more importantly, we said we could also make it into a briefing room for special forces. So, but then the advantages were we could carry more missiles, we could carry boats, we could carry bigger boats, and a lot of effort went into that. However, the 4 strike craft never materialized, and they made 1, so we just made another single one. But that visit could have given us a lengthened strike craft.
I've flown over some of his strike craft, and I always noticed that the officers, the commanders, as I think, were standing on top of it. They're like standing on the roof of, and I'm sorry about that word, I know it's not naval, but does this thing not have an enclosed bridge?
No, strike craft, that's one of the great things about strike craft was that they had open bridges. You went through the wheelhouse, which was the engine controls and the radar and the chart table. But you could not stand and watch down there because you had no vision. You had machinery in front of you, the radar in front of you. The bridge was open, it was up on the top, and at sea, even in foul weather, you could have to duck. It was, to me, fantastic because you never had, you sensed everything, you could see everything. Your sense of awareness was that thing. I remember on frigates, one of the captains actually had rear view mirrors put on his bridge because he couldn't see what was happening astern. And I've been to sea on the new corvettes, frigates, and I get a feeling of, not claustrophobia, but I can't see, I don't know. The strike craft for operations were fantastic because at night, especially at night during operations, you were out there, you knew exactly where you were, you could see, you could sense, you could hear. Everything was very realistic. But I'll keep that for another day.
Well, we are getting to operations in the next one. I'm pleased to tell all of you, the Admiral agreed to at least another episode, but I hope there will be more. And he's today sitting in his bar. Now, I don't know what's that called in naval terms. Watering hole. What do you call it, sir, on a ship? A mess?
I just call it a bar.
Right. So can you tell me about it, that flag behind you? What is it?
That's the South African Naval Ensign, small one worn by strike craft. In 1981, this particular flag was replaced by one with a castle in it. And that actually is the last one ever flown at sea by the South African Navy. At sunset, we take down our flags. And on the 30th of May, 1981, every ship of the Navy was either alongside or up in Richards Bay for a big parade. And my ship was the only ship at sea. I'll tell you later more about that, but we were 5 miles off the coast near Angolan port with our recce's ashore, and we weren't supposed to be flying any flags, but we had the new one as well. So at 1:45 we hoisted this one. At midnight, we ceremoniously lowered it and hoisted the new one. And 15 minutes later, we took it down. 4 recce got the one, I got the other. It was a 4 recce operation, only 4 recce.
Well, so we can say it's a battle flag.
It's a battle flag in a way. But a battle flag is normally a very, very big flag. If you can see it, I've got battle flags above me. And I've got the one from flown the same day by a frigate, because for the last time she ever flew it as well. And they're big flags so that the enemy, so you recognize your friends.
That's actually a big deal for you people in the Navy. You do want to fight under your own flag. I was thinking Q ships while I was listening to you. But it would be utterly wrong to the laws of war and decency, not to reveal your true identity before the shots are fired.
Well, actually, the Q ships didn't go under flag of ruse. They just looked like merchant ships. But you're talking about the raiders, which are merchant cruisers or commissioned ships. But the German raiders used to use a false flag, but they always, before firing, pulled it down, and you only fired with your flag flying or ensign flying. That was one of the rules. So,
do you think it's possible today? Do you think it's possible the concept of a raider or a Q ship, that if you can get that warship close enough to sink it?
The concept would be difficult today in a way because we're not actually in that type of warfare situation. It could be used. The worst case I know was the sinking of the Sydney, HMAS Sydney, which was sunk by getting too close to, I think it was Thor, which convinced her that she was actually, and she thought that Thor was a German ship, but merely a supply ship. In the few seconds it took them to fire, they opened up and she just got too close. I don't think it will happen easily because identifying ships nowadays is a lot easier. Take a picture on your phone, push a button, and someone says, no, that's not us, we're here. So AIS, actually your information system, etc., will change all that.
While we were talking, the Admiral told me that I was completely wrong when I told the story about the South African submarine sinking a helicopter by way of torpedo. It was a damn good story. And that fellow who told me that if he's listening, I'm going to get you behind the shack somewhere in the future. But he did tell me another story, sir. He said to me sometimes, I don't know which ship he was because, he was floating a bit around to that as well. But he said you could be allowed to catch fish. And then they would be catching a lot of fish and you would have fresh fish to eat that night. Is that true?
Oh, yes. The fishing is always in. In fact, when we come to special operations, there's a lovely fishing story which I can tell as well. But ships, if they're ahead of time, could always anchor and put out your fishing lines. I mean, I remember I was navigator for a voyage on the Protea. We actually went to Mount Vima, which is, finding it is quite interesting because it's a mountain in the middle of the sea. And you can actually anchor there and you can fish. And it used to be a wonderful place for crayfish, but they were all gone. But that was the one nice thing about the Navy. You could always catch fish if you wanted. I used to do range clearance on Fleer, the ship I mentioned, the torpedo ship. And I always took dockyard mateys out because they wanted to go to sea as well. And they, especially during the snook season, we'd find the snook as well. We had to be in the area, so we snook. Unfortunately, I never realized that when they pulled them in, they were cutting my guardrails to pieces, but luckily they replaced them. Do you have a copy of Iron Fist from the sea or not?
No, I don't. I don't actually. I should get one.
Okay, because the whole story.
I will definitely do that because I know it's one of the best books ever written. Yeah.
No, there's it's a South African version. Just out of interest, that's Cookie.
Okay, yeah, that's him. That was before the.
Front picture, that's Cookie. Yeah, there's Fikey. These are the guys. This was taken 4 hours before they were dead. Sorry, 6 hours before they died.
Yes, Frans sent me the picture.
Yeah, when Doe and I wrote the book, the first cover was selected by the publisher. This cover, we said we want it because Doe was the land commander and I was the sea commander. This is the one operation we shared completely. We were the two commanders.
You know what you two actually should do is I started a new thing here, a new playlist called Books. And if the two of you can get together and discuss that book, I can guarantee you people are going to not only buy it like you can't believe, but they're going to really appreciate it. Because there's a lot of people say to me that they know this book, they read this book. Because that would be...
Chris, thank you very much for everything you're doing. It's really fantastic. I'm learning. I've got an awful lot to go through still. Some of them will take a long time to follow. I don't have that much time, I'm afraid. I'm always busy with things. So,
well, I'm most grateful. I must tell you, whatever time you have, we're available. I'm like, you know, when I wrote all those books, and the Navy played such a major role in the books, in a fictional way, of course, because I wanted to impart functionality. I wanted to say to people, yeah, you've got the instrument second to none. And I know that the Navy can do operations with special forces, but you cannot believe. I mean, people will think it's nonsense. I know it. But yet, no one in South Africa seems to care. And this bothers me. We should care. We should adapt these jobs.
From 78 to 1988, I think we were the best defense force in all categories in the world. We had more experience than anybody else. It was just wonderful.
Yeah, but it's still the same people. It's the same DNA. We just have better weapons now. It's just, we need an enemy. We can get a nice enemy. I'm just talking. Well, we came to the end of another episode of Admiral Söderlund. I must tell you, it's fascinating. This is really wonderful for me to hear the inside stories. Thank you for your time, Admiral. Thank you for being willing to come back again. Until we meet, to all of you, until we meet again, God bless.